People need to stop this nonsense. NATO will never beat Russia. NATO will never beat Russia. For the Ukrainians to say that they want to punch through the Russian defensives, get to the Sea of Azov, cut off Crimea, cut off the land bridge connecting Crimea to Russia, threaten Crimea and get the Russians to surrender is like me saying I'm going to be on Mars in a year and a half. It just isn't going to happen. It's incapable of happening. Now, what's happened so far with this counteroffensive is the exact opposite. What they're demonstrating is the truth, that no matter what NATO does, Ukraine will never be able to defeat Russia. Moreover, Russia will eventually strategically defeat Ukraine regardless of the NATO assistance. And so Zelensky can't afford to have NATO roll into its summit on July 11th with this perception, to continue to throw troops, double down on stupid, continue to throw troops into the breach, because he has to show something on July 11th. But what he's going to show is the total destruction of the 60,000 strong Ukrainian force that NATO has been building since October of last year. It's going to be eliminated. And then the question confronting NATO is, does Germany come in? And then if the Germany comes in, are they going to do it by themselves? Or are they going to articulate for an Article 4 covered by NATO? And now we have NATO-Russian involvement in Ukraine, and there we are, one step away from the world ending. This is the stupidity of this escalation. People need to stop this nonsense. NATO will never beat Russia. NATO will never beat Russia. That will never happen. The United States will never beat Russia. We don't have the military capacity to defeat Russia in a large-scale ground conflict in Europe. That is a statement of fact. We could put everything America has in Europe today, and the Russians will beat us because we're not that good anymore. Now, we could spend trillions of dollars to rebuild the American conventional warfighting capability, but that's going to take years. The army we have right now cannot fight the Russians. It's physically unable to fight the Russians. As General Cavoli, the commander of U.S. forces in Europe and the Supreme Allied Commander, noted last January in a presentation he made to a Swedish Defense Forum, the scope and scale of the violence taking place in Ukraine between the Ukrainians and the Russians is beyond the imagination of NATO. Listen to what I just said, beyond the imagination. Now, if you're a military planner, that means you haven't imagined this, so everything you're planning for doesn't take into account reality. You don't have the firepower necessary. You don't have the force structure necessary. You don't have the tactics. You don't have the equipment. You don't have anything necessary to fight that conflict. And that's the state of play with NATO forces today. They spent the last 20 years preparing to do nation building in Afghanistan, low intensity conflict around the world, limited military peacekeeping missions in Europe. The last thing NATO has been preparing to do is put 120,000 men across the border to carry out large-scale ground combat against a peer-level force who is combat hardened and has been doing this for 15 months, is more prepared than they are. NATO can't do this, and yet van der Leyen, Stoltenberg, and others continue to pretend as if NATO has this capacity. They don't. NATO is bankrupt. They're bankrupt in terms of their training, their capacity. They've given all their weapons away to Ukraine. That's been burned up. They don't have the ability to build new weapons. Germany has just come out and they're sort of admitting that all this talk about spending 100 billion euros to rebuild the German army is just talk, because no matter what Rheinmetall wants to do, they can't afford the steel. Nobody can make the steel because of high energy costs. The raw materials necessary to build this military either can't be procured or are too expensive to be procured. And that's all of Europe is in that situation. So this notion of a rebuilt NATO army, etc., or in America, find a defense contractor right now that's prepared to do the short-term contracting necessary to produce the weapons that Ukraine needs. They won't. Why? Because their job isn't to create an American or a global defense capable of standing up to Russians. Their job is to make money. Their job is contracting. So they say, if you want us to do this, we need long-term contracts so we produce enough equipment so that the profit margin is sufficient to make our investors and our board members happy. Russia doesn't have that problem. When Putin and the Russian leadership say, we need you to do X, Y, and Z, the Russian defense industry says, yep, we're doing it, because they work for the state. They actually care about the defense of the state. Lockheed Martin and Raytheon don't give a rat's ass, excuse my language, about the defense of America. They only care about the bottom line. And right now, They are saying, we're not going to do the short-term contracting that you want us to do to meet the supply requirements for Ukraine. We need longer-term contracts, but that's very expensive, and now we run into budget issues because Congress has to weigh in on that, and now we get a debate within Congress about whether or not this is the right thing to do.